Ora Nadrich, mindfulness author and columnist at DailyClout. I am very excited to be talking to my two guests today, Rabbi Pesach Wolicki and Pastor Doug Reed, who have a very thought-provoking podcast called Shoulder to Shoulder, where a pastor and rabbi get to the heart of issues that matter to people of faith. Welcome, Rabbi Pesach and Pastor Doug.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for having us.
It's an honor.
Thank you. So my first question to you both is, how did a rabbi and pastor decide to do a podcast together?
Well, it sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. This pastor actually walked into a synagogue in Israel. We connected because I got brought on a trip for the very first time to Israel. About 30 pastors from across the country. We came with a ministry called Eagle's Wings, and Bishop Robert Stearns brought us. And then we did a Bible study for an hour in a synagogue, 30 evangelical pastors and a rabbi. And that trip changed my life. I've been back to Israel several times since. And Pesach and I built a friendship from there. I had him in at my church a number of times in Ohio, where I was pastoring for about 9 years. And he taught my congregation. He preached for me. Our people loved when he came and taught. And we've just hit it off over the years. And I think you contacted me, didn't you, Pesach, and said, hey, would you ever consider doing a podcast? And we kind of went back and forth. And then we got in the studio and did a test run. And then we sent it off to Scott, who's our producer now, and said, hey, what do you think? And he said, I would tweak this, this, and this. And then we came back and we started doing episodes.
Well, you definitely have a synergy between the two of you. I've listened to a few of your episodes, and there's a wonderful synergy that you both seem to have. But I'm curious, would you say that the two of you, who are of different faiths, one a Christian, the other a Jew, have more in common or have more differences between you in how you view God and faith?
That's a great question, Ora, because that really gets to the heart of what we're trying to do on the podcast. Let me explain what I mean. Everyone knows, everyone who's paying attention is aware that there is a lot of support for Israel among evangelical Christians. Right? Evangelical Christians, they have a biblical worldview, and they see what's going on in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel over the last century, but especially over the last few decades. The mass ingathering of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is foretold in the Bible, and they see the Jewish people in our land, and they visit the Holy Land, and they experience that, and they support the nation of Israel. But very often, more often than not, the relationship doesn't really go beyond that. And when I got to know Doug and I started speaking in his church, and I speak in other churches as well, this is what I do, but there was a real connection between us. And when I speak in churches, I don't speak about Israel. I mean, I'm from Israel. People will ask questions, but most of the time I just do a Bible study. As Doug said, he came to a synagogue in Israel with a group of 30 pastors, and we did a Bible study. The Bible study wasn't about Israel. It was just, we studied a chapter out of the book of Genesis together. And I shared my perspective, the Jewish perspective. I shared some of the insights that come from the Hebrew that maybe they didn't have access to. And it ceases to be, when you're doing that, it ceases to be what you would call interfaith dialogue, where I'm a Jew, he's a Christian, and we're sort of analyzing what makes us different. But it actually was much more about a shared experience. I believe that the Bible is the divine word. He believes that the Bible is the divine word, and we're studying it together. And what our podcast is really about is about connecting and finding those points of commonality, and sometimes those points of difference, but more often than not, finding some sort of commonality about the issues that we're dealing with. So we might be dealing with an issue in society that has to do with education, that has to do with raising children, that has to do with politics, that has to do with just the spiritual life of a person of faith. And what we find, exactly as you said, is more often than not, we bring our different traditions and we bring our different theology to the table. But what we're really finding through conversation and conversation with our guests is some sort of shared space even within that shared space, we have differences, but it's a shared space.
Pesach, I think it all comes back to the name of the podcast. It comes from a special verse, and Pesach, I've heard him talk about it and teach on it, so I'm not going to steal your thunder because I think it's really, really good. But the idea of shoulder to shoulder comes from a verse in the Bible where, and I've heard Pesach teach on this, we're not, as much as we obviously have some very critical theological differences, but the 90+% of stuff that we agree on and look at the world through those Judeo-Christian values, it allows us that space to kind of feel together. And the things that arise in the world right now, the secular humanism and a lot of this stuff that's pushing its way in, the far secular left or radical Islam, all of that pushes us into a space where they don't care if I'm a Christian or a Jew. They'll gladly kill a Jew or a Christian that believes in the book. And so in that sense, we're really in this boat together. And the more conversations we have and the more guests we have, the more we learn that. But Pesach, you should unpack our name, because shoulder to shoulder is really, really important. And I thought it was really great the way you came up with it.
Well, thank you for teeing that up, Doug. There's a verse in the book of Zephaniah. It's Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9. And it's one of the many prophecies in the Bible that speak about a time in the end, in some perfect future, when all the peoples of the world all serve God together. And, and I know that there's probably people listening to this on DailyClout. You have a very wide range of people. So just understand the concept here. We're talking about seeking a time when all of us are all connecting spiritually together. Now, that doesn't mean that we're all the same. And Judaism particularly, right from in the Bible, where the nation of Israel is chosen to have a specific covenant with God, Judaism never seeks to make everyone Jewish. So those prophecies in that same Bible that speak about a time when everyone is serving God together do not assume that everyone has become the same. We're not the same. But in that verse in Zephaniah, it speaks about the entire world praising God and serving him. And the Hebrew here is Shechem Echad. Now, the word Shechem is one of the words for shoulder. It's a biblical Hebrew word for shoulder. Shechem Echad literally translates as one shoulder. But if you look in biblical translations, almost none of them say one shoulder. Very hard to find that. If you go to one of these websites that has all the translations of the Bible listed there, you look up that verse, most of them say one of two translations. They either say shoulder to shoulder, or they say in one accord or one agreement, that all the peoples of the world will serve God in agreement, or they'll serve God shoulder to shoulder. And I was once looking up this verse. I read the Bible in Hebrew, so I don't usually look up translations unless I'm preparing to teach or write for an audience that doesn't know Hebrew. And I was looking up this verse, and I was frustrated because I couldn't find a translation. I like to quote from published translations. I couldn't find a translation that said what it says in the Hebrew. The Hebrew says one shoulder. And then it hit me that there's a very powerful difference between what the actual Hebrew says, one shoulder, and shoulder to shoulder. So even though we called the podcast Shoulder to Shoulder, the vision in the Bible is really serving God as one shoulder. Now think about the difference between shoulder to shoulder and one shoulder. Because if we're shoulder to shoulder, we're bearing the same burden. We're side by side. We're helping each other. But we're shoulder to shoulder. I'm in my body. You're in yours. When we're done bearing this burden, we're going to go our separate ways. If I feel pain, you don't feel it. But if we're one shoulder, the biblical poetry of these prophecies is so beautiful. If all the peoples of the world are serving God as one shoulder, it means that we feel each other's pain. It means that we're not going our separate ways when all is said and done. It means that we are truly together. And I wouldn't say that Judaism and Christianity have reached that point. We're not at that point right now, but that is really the the vision of what our podcast is all about is really finding that shared space, sharing our spiritual lives with each other, and finding more often than not that our perspectives do align.
Wouldn't you say, when you speak of speaking a time where we will come together, and I think of that as a type of unity, I may have different languaging that I'll use, sort of a collective consciousness, if you will, one people, oneness, where we have no division between us, be it religious or otherwise, at a time right now when I view, as many of us do, the world is at a point where we are more polarized and there is more dissent than I ever remember in my lifetime. So, how do you really apply the philosophies that you both have, respectively, to the times that we're in right now?
Yeah, it's the greatest setup for a philosophy like that. It lets us run counter to the culture. Blending in, anybody can be polarizing and bombastic, and you can get the clicks and you can have the following. But to really be modeling something that is counter to the culture and be stepping out with values and with thoughts that run against the grain, it causes you to stand out. It causes it to be, kind of put on display. But how do you spread that message then becomes the question, and how do you transfer that? And I think it's just one person at a time. I think every time I brought Rabbi Pesach into my church, for Christians who were raised in that Christian space and bubble, like, I had people in my church, I don't understand. like why are we bringing a rabbi into our space? And I had to coach, and I had to teach, and I had to help nudge that along. Like, I'm not becoming a Christian because I have a rabbi coming into my space. I'm actually a better Christian because of people like Rabbi Pesach, because of our relationship. I'm a better pastor, I'm a better leader, I'm a better father, because of the relationship that we've built. And so I think as people get to see the benefits in that on display, it just allows us to really shine a light in a dark place, and lights get really bright when stuff is dark.
I'd like to take your question in a different direction, Ora, which is, when you speak about the polarization of society today, and it is severe, I would agree with you. I turned 53 yesterday, and in my life, I can't imagine I never imagined polarization like this. We now have a world in which where people fall on the political spectrum isn't just a matter of what their opinion is of this or that issue, but it actually speaks to what reality they're living in. Exactly. I mean, we literally, we're reaching a point where people have just completely different frameworks for how they interpret everything that's going on in society. Now, with that, we're also seeing a realignment. And the more visible realignment that people are seeing is a political realignment, where the old definitions of right and left have kind of gone by the wayside. And coalitions are forming around concepts like liberty in more meaningful ways than they have in a very long time. But at the same time, I believe we're seeing something else going on in the spiritual realm between religions. So what we were just talking about before, this kind of shared space that Doug and I find ourselves in terms of our values. And so many of our guests share that space, be they rabbis or other pastors, where we're finding more and more people are realizing that their real shared language and shared space is with people who see the world through the same lens of overall values. And what's considered, for lack of a better term, the enemy or the other side, or those who are living in that other reality, can be also across the spectrum. So I'll have fellow Jews, and Doug will have fellow Christians that we also view them as on the other side of things. Meaning we're having this realignment that's going on, and I think that in a way there's been a real clarification going on. There's a fascinating line in the Talmud which speaks about, it's a kind of a cryptic line. It talks about the ultimate redemption, right? The Messiah coming, the ultimate kingdom of God. And it says the Messiah will only come in a generation that is either completely evil or completely good or completely righteous. That's a very cryptic statement. Okay, who could imagine a society that's completely evil or a society that's completely righteous? And there was a great rabbi who lived a couple hundred years ago, at the end of the 18th century, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, one of our greatest geniuses of the last few hundred years. And he said that statement in the Talmud is actually referring to the same time period. That you can have a time period that is both purely evil and purely good. And what does that mean? What he meant is that things become very, very clear. There's no more gray areas. I think of it this way. You remember when pictures had negatives where you'd actually go to get film processed?
Mm-hmm.
So the only way to see a truly accurate photograph is to either look at the photograph itself or to look at the absolute negative of the photograph. Anything in between is not going to be clear. And I think that what we're experiencing now is a clarification. That this digging in, meaning as much as we're polarized, and that's heartrending, and we feel terrible that we're so polarized and we're losing our ability to communicate with other people, things are also being very clarified. And I think a lot of people who used to be on the fence or used to be apolitical and weren't paying attention to big issues and spiritual issues are waking up. And I think on the spiritual side, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a pastor, but I certainly celebrate the fact that I believe in the younger generation in America today. On the one hand, again, you're seeing the same polarization. There's kids moving towards this extreme progressive ideology on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a great awakening taking place where there's this growth in spirituality and connection to God. So we're in the middle of this. I mean, the hardest place to have a perspective on a historical era is being the one living through it.
Absolutely. I want to jump in because I have a new book out called Time to Awaken, Changing the World with Conscious Awareness. And during the last couple of years, we know the world has changed radically. And at the beginning of it, I'm a dot connector, and I'm very much inquisitive, and I ask questions, And what came to me very strongly during this time, I really felt it was sort of, I call it a divine download, if you will. The Great Awakening came up for me. Now, I've never known of what that meant, and I did research on the term the Great Awakening. And from a religious point of view, you probably know more in depth about it than I do, that there have been so-called Great Awakenings throughout time, and they were considered religious revivals. When I think people were asking questions or religion was waning during those times. So the Great Awakening is a very powerful thought to hold in one's mind, to think, wow, we're in this time. I perceive it as a great spiritual awakening. Do you know? And what I see in front of my eyes is a lot playing out that really goes back to what you said about what we would interpret as good, evil, light, dark, to the likes of which I've never seen in my lifetime. And my only comparison to that is what happened in Nazi Germany. I know people don't take that comparison lightly. And my father lost his entire family in the Holocaust. So this time that we're in right now, and what I also say in my book is that it's as if we're living in parallel universe or a parallel reality. There are those that are very aware and cognizant of the changes that are happening. And what is that really evoking people? What is that calling them towards? Is it calling them towards a more spiritual belief in human existence? Or is it moving them away from something like religion? We see this happening.
I think it's doing both.
I was going to say, I think it's doing both, but I'll point to an event that was very recent in the news, international. So you had the Buffalo Bills player, Damar Hamlin, right? He gets hit, stands up, falls over dead. They perform 9 minutes of CPR on him. You have grown men worth millions of dollars sobbing watching their friend be worked on the field. And they've all seen injuries before. They've all seen players get carted off, but this was different. And you watch the players gather and pray. You watch the stadium begin to pray. You watch newscasters on ESPN pray live on the air. And essentially you have probably what is the largest spontaneous prayer meeting take place. Millions of people, I forget how many millions of people, I think it was 23 million people were watching the game at the time. And I'm not saying every one of them prayed, but in that moment, this tragedy rallied all these people to a place where all of a sudden, prayer was important. God was real. We had this need that was beyond our capacity to do anything. And so we had to reach out. And so, yes, while we're in the middle of, this polarizing kind of space, I think deep down, when it comes to it, there's an old adage: there's never an atheist in a foxhole. When it comes down to it, and you hit a tragedy, and you hit stuff like that. You remember after 9/11, I can remember, churches were filled, and people were looking for meaning and hope, and it presented a moment. Tragedy gives us this moment to come in and kind of, it tears away all the extra stuff, all the, the frills, and it just gets down to the raw brass tacks of it all, that, man, this is what's important. And I'm in Buffalo, so it was very much at the center. Every business had a praying for Damar banner up, banks and car washes, and people was the first thing on their lips. And so even for this region, it became a kind of central focus. And it wasn't a throwaway line. It wasn't a thoughts and prayers on Twitter. Like, people meant it, and it was sincere, and it was unlike anything I've seen as a pastor, except maybe going back to 9/11 when we had that tragedy come in. And you hate to say that tragedy brings us to that place, but I often wonder if it's God's way of getting our attention.
Well, you speak of shoulder to shoulder versus, one shoulder. So unfortunately, I think a lot of these tragedies, like what you mentioned, 9/11 or the most recent event, we see that it brings us together. But it seems that it brings us together for a short period of time. And unfortunately, most people go back to their daily lives. And the power of prayer is real. I'm a believer myself. I'm curious now, the times that we're in, that we don't just come together there. Are we in fact getting more inert or numb to the tragedies that we're facing, so that, our inclination may be to come together in that moment in time to pray together, but then are we more quickly and more readily returning to our separate lives?
I mean, that's the problem of the attention deficit culture, that we've been led into by so much of the technology and the media with which we live. But going back to the question you posed that Doug just responded to about, are we experiencing a great awakening? Are people moving further away from faith? Are we coming together? Where are we really? I go back to this point about clarity. We have, as part of this polarization and this radical realignment of people and these different realities we live in, we're in this great battle for truth. It's like nothing. I've been following politics closely my entire life. I've never experienced such a battle over information, over narrative, over truth. And these are very real battles.
Yes.
And the fact that, and here's the interesting thing, you don't have people on different sides of the battle when it comes to different issues. Meaning, where people are, for example, on the debate about the vaccines, and where they are in their attitudes about the current administration's soft pedaling the relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. There's no reason in the world why if you think about old-fashioned politics, why people's opinions about a vaccine and about the CCP should line up. And you could add we could start adding more issues there about what's going on in the schools. where people line up on a whole host of issues is becoming incredibly consistent. And that's actually almost a defining feature of the polarization. You know, if someone tells you their attitude about one thing, you can already assume that you already know what they believe about a whole host of other issues.
Right.
Now, but there's a silver lining here. The silver lining is that as we continue to battle for the truth, people, when the veil gets lifted, and people and for different people it happens at different times. We all know people who this has happened to. When the veil gets lifted and people see the truth about one of these things and go, oh my gosh, then it's an avalanche. Everything else clicks into place. And ultimately, in this battle for truth, it's not going to be a sudden victory. It's going to be gradual. This is trench warfare. When we win this battle for truth, it's going to open up the floodgates. Right. So we're in the middle of it now. I'm going to say again what I just said before. You know, history has one defining feature that makes it different than everything else on the planet. Most things, almost everything in the world, the closer you are, the more proximity you have to a person, to a place, to a thing, the better you know it.
Right.
But history, I believe, is the exact opposite. Who understands the fall of the Roman Empire better? Someone living at the time, or someone, or us who can read about it and see the full scope of history? History is a funny thing. The people who understand a historical moment the least are the people living through that moment, because our vision is so muddled by the fog of war and what we're involved in.
Right.
But I think that's where faith comes in. That's where the Bible can come in and help us, because we have this 30,000-foot view of things. The Bible starts at the creation and it ends long after we're gone from this world. It's the big story of humanity.
Exactly.
And when we can pull back from the world that we're living in and look at it from that perspective of the great sweep of history, we can gain a greater perspective. We're in the thick of it right now.
Yes,
it's hard to see how this gets sorted out. But again, that radical alignment of issues that we're seeing actually means, now of course it means that if we were to lose the battle, then all is lost. And this is where it's good to be a person of faith. I believe that, you know, God is on our side and we're going to win, and we are fighting for truth.
Right.
And ultimately, I think the numbers of the population are shifting in our direction. But it also means that when people shift on one issue, they shift on a whole bunch of issues at the same time.
Right. I understand. I want to say, you know, when you speak about lifting the veils of truth, which is another term that I've used in my book, interestingly enough, how those of us that are like-minded seem to use the same expressions. But
that's what it feels like. Yeah,
it does, doesn't it? And engenders faith that there are more of us that are seekers of the truth. But it is incumbent upon us, and I talk about this when I speak and I do my book reviews, that for people they themselves to lift the veils, not wait for the veils to be lifted for them. And we know that many do not want to work that hard. It's work. It's hard work to want to lift the veils, to seek the truth, to want to know the truth, especially at a time when we know all too well that the truth is being very manipulated. There's things today like censorship and cancel culture and a distortion of the truth and gaslighting. And now, I mean, we can go into so many areas in this conversation about how people can be, through AI manipulation, be showed that they're saying something that they really didn't say. These are very, very precarious times that we're in.
Yeah, but Ora, you know, it always requires leaders to drag the population along. Like when you say that there's so many people who don't want to work hard, they don't want to see the truth. Look, when Moses took the people of Israel out of Egypt, they complained the whole way. They didn't want to do anything. And that's the way it goes. And you know, if we know that we are in a position to influence, then we must influence. You have to realize that's just the way human beings are.
Right.
And that all that means is that we have to fight even harder, because those same people are sheep for the other side.
Exactly.
You know, and we just need to win them over.
I agree.
That's-
I agree. I think that that's what our work is about. Our work is about that we can really, spread, share, whatever it's going to take to have others be able to, and not to try and convince them to come over to our side. And both of you, with what the work that you do, you can only shine a light. You can only speak of the truth in order for others to maybe see what they haven't seen thus far. And we are the ones that are shedding the truth and putting the light on the truth.
There's an expression in the Gospels. Jesus says, "You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free."
Right.
And I think that adage is true throughout history. So, Pesach mentioned kind of the arc of history. When you look at history, truth prevails. Now, sometimes kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. Sometimes the center of power shifts, but ultimately, truth prevails. Whether it has to pop up and give birth to a new nation in another space called America, truth prevails. People talk about, the history of the United States and some of the horrible things with slavery and all that's gone into that. Yeah, but truth prevailed. The abolitionists won. That we fought a war for some of those things, and our values continue to work themselves out. And so I think I'm hopeful when I look at the future to know that ultimately truth sets people free.
Yes.
And the more truth we get in front of people, the more people will be free, and the more we'll be able to journey, God willing, to a better future.
And I know there's a lot for us to cover, and we only have so much time. And I know that maybe those changes won't happen as quickly as we would like them to. But I agree with you both. I think we are on that trajectory where truth is presenting itself to us. And I do also agree that truth will set us free. So let me ask you, let's go into a couple of my questions, if you will. What role do you think religion is playing in the world today? But specifically, I want to talk about the younger demographics. It's important to talk about the generations of today and of tomorrow.
Yeah, I think on the church front, there's like this undertone that the church is in decline. And I go back to, I forget who the famous philosopher was, but he declared that, the Bible was dead, and 50 years from now, the Bible will be gone. And today, the American Bible Society bought his house and prints Bibles out of it. And I just find that, some of that stuff where we pronounce the death of religion, and it's all over. In the 60s with kind of the hippie movement, all of that. Then came the Jesus People movement and this kind of resurgence that happened in the church in the 70s. And you can look at time and time again. You have these kind of ebbs and flows throughout history. So when I look at the next generation and I hear people say, that the generation, doesn't want anything to do with God, I think they're figuring it out on their own. I think they're navigating through issues we never had to navigate through. I think they have information at the tips of their fingers. I think they're being raised in a very different world. And the hope and prayer is to meet them on the field, on the court where they're playing the game. And so often in religious circles, we invite them to come and play in our arena. And I think one of the powerful tools, particularly in the New Testament, is we're sent to their arena. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul stands and gives one of his most famous sermons in front of a pagan temple to an unknown God. And he says, I know who this God is. And he proclaims, the gospel there. And I think for the church, for religious people, for people of faith, it's a challenge to engage culture. But then there's also the flip side. As much as we need to engage culture, we don't need to become like the culture. We need to invite them to something better. And I think as I meet more and more young people, we have a pretty vibrant young adult ministry at our church. And as I meet more and more of them, they were searching for something, and then they came and they found something that was better. And they got to experience it, and they got to step into it. And we get to invite them into this faith space that's worked for thousands of years. There's a reason that the Bible is the most popular book ever printed. There's a reason that people hunger and thirst for the same things. They're looking for that purpose and that meaning, and I don't think that's ever going away.
I listened to your podcast, Can Social Media Save Faith? And felt that your guest, Rabbi Dr. Ari Lam, sounded very hopeful of the younger generation having an interest in religion. He did bring up influencer Montana Tucker as being someone who's using her very successful platform on both TikTok and Instagram to make her generation more aware of the Holocaust, having both her grandparents lose their families in concentration camps. I think it's fantastic that she's doing that, especially at a time when there are more Holocaust deniers than ever before. And with more and more survivors dying, the only way their stories can be told and remembered is by people or family members who are keeping their memory alive. But when you have anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head amongst the younger generation and have someone as famous as Kanye West, for example, making anti-Semitic remarks, that's when social media can be used to perpetuate hatred and racism, and may do the very opposite of engendering or saving faith, especially among the younger generations. What do you two think about that?
Look, the rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing now it's a different kind of anti-Semitism than we saw in the past. It's not institutional. Meaning, if we go back in America, to the early part of the 20th century, let's say, you still had neighborhoods that had bylaws that forbade the selling of a home to a Jew. You had colleges that had quotas restricting the number of Jews, right? You had that kind of institutional anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism that we have today is a kind of thuggish anti-Semitism. So it's still a problem. And we certainly have a problem. The Israeli government just came out with just was publicizing a study that was done about where anti-Semitism is really coming from mostly. And most of the anti-Semitism that we have today is really coming out of the progressive left, which is, it's wrapped up in a hatred of the state of Israel. So we have these issues of anti-Semitism, but at the same time, it all is part of a package. Meaning, if we do our job and expose people to a better way of living, and we have to, when we look at young people today and we're worried about where they are with their TikTok culture and what we see, and if you watch too many, if you scroll through your Twitter feed too much, you can get a really dark view of what's going on in the world. Because I think the people who are up to the who are doing disturbing things get a lot of clicks. But as Doug was saying, there's so many young people today that they're intelligent, they're seeing what's going on, and they're searching for meaning. And if we could provide them a doorway into a positive life, the anti-Semitism is at this point right now today. It's not the anti-Semitism isn't in the church. The anti-Semitism isn't coming from the faith community. It's not coming from the community of people who believe in family formation and raising nice and going to church on Sunday. It's coming from the same elements that are pushing a lot of the other nefarious things.
Right.
So to me, it's all bound up in the same battles. It's all bound up in this same as I said before, the way the lines are drawn today, it seems that our enemies on one issue are our enemies on all issues.
Right.
So I think it's all wrapped up. Now, how do we reach the younger people today? As Doug was saying, we got to reach them where they are. And Rabbi Ari Lam, when we had him on the podcast, he made such a good point about the fact that, like, well, yeah, younger people don't go to church. They also don't go to anything. They don't go to movie theaters. They don't, they're just looking at their phones. They don't go to things. And so if that's where they are, that's where we have to find them. But I'm also optimistic. I don't know. That's one thing that Doug and I very much have in common. I believe that the end of the story is good. The end of the story is good. Truth will win. And
I agree. I agree with you. I do. And I hope that that's all correct. I'm sorry. I just want to be very mindful of the time.
Sorry.
I'm concerned about the younger generation because in an article in American Life, Generation Z and the Future of Faith in America by Daniel A. Cox, and based on the Survey Center on American Life, it talks about the religious change in America, especially religious disaffiliation. And that is often the result of independent decisions made by a rising generation living by a different set of values. And that new evidence paints a much more complicated picture than the traditional narrative of generationally driven disaffiliation. Basically, it says that young adults today have had entirely different religious and social experiences than previous generations did. The parents of millennials and Generation Z, which I am one of, did less to encourage, which I did not, encourage regular participation in formal worship services and model religious behaviors than had previous generations. Many childhood religious activities that were once common, such as saying grace or perhaps lighting the Shabbat candles, have become more of the exception than the norm. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, being a millennial, and Pesach's birthday was yesterday, my birthday's next week, and I'll be 38. And so being a millennial, when I look at that, my headspace goes to the way that my parents raised me, and we've talked about this a ton on our podcast. The family unit, having a mother and father in the home, the statistics bear it out over and over again. The influence of the parents in the home is essential for kids to grow up. They're less likely to go to prison. They're more likely to graduate high school. Like all of those statistics are there. You can Google them. When the family unit is intact, when mom and dad are separated, when you have all of these things, it's not that they can't have a good outcome. It's just statistically, it's more likely when you have a family unit. And then when the family is going to regular religious services and doing those sort of things, and it's a practice in the home, it bears it out. I think the other side, and I'll own this on the Christian side of things, the modern attempt in the church to reach the next generation, we have unfortunately entertained them and not discipled them. We've offered them what we basically did church MTV style in the 90s and 2000, and the kids went, oh, that's cool, but it didn't offer them anything of substance. It offered them the same light show and some music with different lyrics. And
then when they go off to college, that's not going to last.
Correct. It does not last. And I think there's, and I'll say in my stream, there's this real resurgence to go back to our ancient faith. And let's go back and do the things that we did at first. Let's ask God for the ancient pathways, and let's go back to that place because it works. We can try our best, but I don't have the money to compete with Disney. I don't have the money to compete with some of these things, but I have something better. And so instead of trying to compete with them, I don't have to. I'm going to give them the real thing, and it tastes better, and it is better, and it works. So I think that's part of the struggle. I know in the church, I think Barna statistics is 3 out of 4 kids will leave your youth group, go off to college, and leave the church and never come back.
Right.
And that's because we spent 18 years entertaining them and not discipling them. And my parents, to their credit, discipled me. I learned the Bible. We practiced things in the home. And so that stuff stuck because it was important to mom and dad.
Doug,
but Ora's raising another point, though, which is the fact that we now have a situation where, because of the way these younger generations have been raised, they're simply they're not even raised in it's not like they were mostly raised in a home where everyone was going to church and saying grace and lighting the Shabbat candles or whatever it is. They're not even raised that way. So it's not even a matter of walking away. They're not even raised in a situation that encourages these things. And I think that is a huge mistake that was made by that generation of parents, thinking that their kids are going to have perfectly fine values without the structure and without the ritual that goes along with a life of faith. It's a very serious problem. Now that said, it's not like we cannot say that there's no coming back from this. We cannot say that that's it, all is lost. That's not an option. But I do believe that ultimately the dead end that the secular culture is leading these kids to is going to hit them at some point. How bloody is it going to get, and how much of a disaster is being created? That's a serious question. But we need to get in there and pull people out of the fire. Now, but And on a practical note, I think this only underscores the importance of fighting the battles for what's taught in schools. The fact that the faith community, the faith leadership, has really ceded the public school system to the progressive left has had terrible consequences over the course of the last few decades, where what's going on in a school is no longer encouraging the type of values that are going to lead to positive family formation and the type of spiritual well-being that we were used to in past generations. It's a problem.
Right. I mean, even prayer, any kind of prayer, or you can't even say that word in most schools today. Pray allegiance to the flag. You can't even use those words in schools today. Most schools.
Yeah, well, or a prayer presupposes that there's a force in the world that is greater than me, that I submit to and that I worship.
Right.
And unfortunately, the ideology of today of the transhumanists their ideology is that there's nothing greater than me.
Well,
and the only thing I worship is myself.
Totally. There's so much that I want to talk to both of you about. I mean, when I had told Itana what I wanted to talk about, I said I really want to talk about transhumanism, which was this movement that is one of the most godless movements. I mean, I did research for my book, and I cried as I was researching it, because most those that are so-called transhumanists or futurists with the transhumanism ideology, it's a godless vision for the future of our world. It's very chilling. It's very disturbing. And whatever your God is called, that doesn't even really matter to me. It's that it's godless across the board.
Yeah, that's their absolute truth. And it's so interesting. I find more and more when you start getting into some of those philosophies and some of those thought patterns, they will say they're incredibly tolerant and they have this philosophy of inclusion, but they have some real hard absolutes. And one of those is a future without God.
But this is the future that we are, we're talking about a future of artificial intelligence. I mean, even Elon Musk has come out and said that is the greatest threat of our time. Okay, what's that great Einstein quote? I don't worry about the future because it's already here. I mean, for me personally, I think this has arrived at our doorstep. What are we going to do about it? And I admire and respect both of you tremendously that you are using faith and trying to guide those in the direction where we can really win this battle against good and evil, because it really has come to that. I believe we're in the midst of a spiritual war.
Well, one thing we can do is talk about it, meaning, to make sure that our children and our communities know that things like AI are not neutral. These are dangerous tools, and to also remind everyone that creating a very complex computer that has all the trappings of being sentient does not give it a soul. It does not make it a life. It does not make it a human being. That's not the image of God. But, I actually believe that the whole transhumanist ideology is actually foretold very directly in the Bible in a story in Genesis.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's the story of the Tower of Babel. The story in Genesis 11. It's a very strange tower, but it's a very strange story. But if you really read the story carefully, you see that it's really describing a very similar ideology. It's if you don't mind, or I'll just share with you a few verses.
Okay.
In Genesis chapter 11, that's right at the beginning of the chapter. But listen to the language here. It says the chapter opens. The story opens by saying that the whole world had one language and a common speech. Now, what that means is groupthink.
Mm-hmm.
That means that there's there's only one. And that's what, we talk about the cancel culture. You talk about, everything has to be said a certain way. As people moved eastward, they found a plain and settled there. Now, listen to what it says next. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone. Then they said, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Now, what exactly are they doing? And then God sees what they're doing and says, okay, this is a problem. Once they've done this, how does God react? The Lord came down to see the city and the tower they were building, and he said, if as one people speaking the same language, they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. Now, why do I see transhumanism in this? These people lived in Mesopotamia, and they lived out in a plain, it said. Now, why are they making bricks out of mortar? Why is it so important to them that they use bricks instead of stone? Well, think about it. If you live in ancient Mesopotamia and homes are built out of stone, stones are an organic substance that's right there on earth. God created the stones. A brick is essentially a man-made stone. They were obsessed with their own technology.
Mm-hmm.
And their goal was to build something that would reach up to the heavens. Jewish tradition says that they were trying to make war on God, which is essentially the same idea.
Absolutely.
And their whole goal was to make a name for themselves. That's their goal.
Right.
And this to me speaks the same spiritual language as what the transhumanists strive for. They're obsessed with technology.
Completely.
And they want to make a name for themselves. And in the Bible, what happens is God says, no, we're not going to have any of this. This is not healthy. And he disrupts things. So I don't know what's coming next.
Yeah. Thank you, Pesach, for that, story, because, when I think of the whole transhumanist movement and you take someone like Ray Kurzweil, maybe you could interview him. Right. Okay. I'd like to talk to Ray Kurzweil, who believes we're going to, it'll be the eternal bliss reality if we become spiritual computers, something to the like.
Yeah, but who? All the rice paddy farmers in China, all the people living in Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa, are they all going to be part of this, or just Ray Kurzweil and his buddies?
Right, exactly. I know it's a movement that not everybody agrees with. However, when you have a mindset like that man can play God, and with our advanced technologies, we are creating technologies that are very frightening today. We have them. They've arrived. I talk about this robot that's now at, I think, 100 fast food restaurants called Flippy, who can flip a burger faster than a human can. So it's rather naive for us to think this hasn't arrived. It's here. It's already here. That train has left the station. So I think the idea of juxtaposing that to, do we continue on this journey and think that we are better than God and we can play God like some of these people seem to think they can, and determine what our destiny is for us? This egomaniacal drive to turn us into the least human, beings that we are, which is very disturbing. Something like faith that the two of you speak of so beautifully. I believe having faith in something, again, whatever one chooses to call it, is the only hope we have for resisting this movement to take us somewhere that is devoid, this very dystopian vision for ourselves that is, we know in our hearts, that's not where we are meant to go.
Yeah. All of the technology stuff, it's a slow incremental, it's cooking the frog, it's cooking the lobster. Like, it's a slow, because you look at it and you're like, oh, that's not that big a deal. Yet we can use that to our advantage. Technology's amoral. Like you kind of, I've made all of those arguments, but you look at what is here and you look at what's coming down the pike, and I don't know how, I'm not sure I have the answer on how to navigate that fully. But it's certainly eye-opening, and I don't want to say disheartening, but my kids are going to have to deal with some stuff that I can't even imagine right now.
Absolutely, Doug. I'm so glad you said that. So, we need to.
I'll tell you one thing that we can do, that we can all do, and this doesn't solve the problem, but it does a lot for ourselves and our families and our own spiritual lives. is one of the oldest and most fundamental practices that comes out of the Bible and is central to Judaism. And that is actually having a proper Sabbath. And what I mean by that is a Sabbath where we disengage from technology.
Yes.
Because, you know, as an Orthodox Jew, when it comes sundown on Friday night, everyone's phone gets turned off. I'm not carrying my wallet. No one's talking or thinking about work. No one's going anywhere. There's no computers. There's no TVs. And it's just human interaction, prayer, study, relaxing, playing some board games. It's real life.
Beautiful.
And it's once a week. And I'm grateful for the fact that as an Orthodox Jew, our religious system is a very legalistic system, which often seems very restrictive, but those restrictions produce a space like that. And I think that everyone in society, not just Jews, but everyone in society would benefit if one day a week, unplug everything, disengage from everything, because our identities get bound up in our technologies. Our identities get bound up in our jobs. When we disengage from these things, when we turn them off, when we put them aside for 24 hours, and we're with our families, we're with our communities, and that's another thing we need, a real sense of community with those around us.
Yes.
These things we need to create the space for them in our lives. And unfortunately, if we keep the technology running all the time, then that takes over our identities. I think that's something that everyone can do. Anyone watching this who's, it's one thing to sit and talk about it and to wring our hands and talk about how terrible it is. And there's a lot of people who are going to get swept away in this. There's a lot of damage that is being done, and the disaster is real. It's true.
Yes.
We are living through this spiritual holocaust of that is affecting so much of the world. And those of us who are fighting against it, it's not going to be all rosy, and it's not going to be an easy path to victory. But along the way, we can reinforce ourselves and our families by creating that space. You talk about mindfulness. There's nothing creates mindfulness better than a Sabbath, where we kind of create that sacred space where it's human interaction, it's prayer, it's really cultivating a spiritual identity.
I that's so true and beautiful, and I want to just sort of wrap it up. There's so much more I could speak to both of you about, and what brings to mind when you speak about that, and where it really encompasses both the Judeo-Christian way in which we practice mindfulness, if you will. Even if we had a little mini Sabbath each day, where we put down our phones, not just on the weekends, but let's just have, I say enlightenment comes in little bits along the way, and something like saying grace. If we could really, at our meals, I'm with people sometimes when we're breaking bread together, and we say a prayer, and we're thankful for the food that, and all the blessings that we have. So that, along with what you two represent, if we have those and incorporate those in our day, is it really so much asking us to integrate that into our day? It's a beautiful way to go through our life. So I want to thank both of you so much. Tell us where our listeners can listen to you.
You can catch us anywhere you listen to podcasts. We're on Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and you just look up Shoulder to Shoulder. We also have a group on Facebook under the same name, Shoulder to Shoulder. We have a page on Facebook, etc. And you can connect with me on all the social media spots, and I'm pretty sure Pesach, you're on everything as well.
I'm on everything. I think I'm shadow banned on Facebook, though. So if I post anything, you're not going to see it unless I tag you.
They got you.
I think I'm not sure when it happened, but I'm pretty sure it happened because suddenly my, whatever. No one sees anything I post unless I tag them. But unless it's a picture of my kids, then everyone sees it. I don't know. Somehow Facebook decides if I say anything of substance, no one ever sees it. So, but you can follow me. You can find me. My name is Pesach Wolicki, which is a very unique name. I'm pretty confident when I say that I'm the only person in the world with my name, which is a great luxury, because if you Google my name or you search it, I would, use a different search engine. That might be even better. Or you can go to YouTube and just put my name in. You'll find all kinds of teachings and my writings are out there. So that's really just the easiest way to find me. But please, I'd greatly appreciate it anyone wants to, check this out and really join our space, the conversation in Shoulder to Shoulder is really, it's so meaningful. It's a pastor and a rabbi, and we bring on guests and we talk about issues that really affect all of us.
Absolutely.
And so please, join our conversation. You could also find, I have a weekly column on Israel365news.com. That's a great news website about Israel. And I do a weekly column on the weekly Torah portion. So, the Jewish calendar, over the course of the year, we go through the 5 books of Moses. So each week there's a weekly Torah portion, and I write a column on that. You can catch my writings there.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you so much, Rabbi Pesach and Pastor Doug, for the work that you both are doing. I've listened to your podcast. It's terrific. I highly encourage our listeners and viewers to listen to your podcast. And again, thank you so much for both of you being my guests here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.